All right, let me give a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan. And joining us today as a guest is Lena.
Hi, Ohan. I'm Lena Riemer.
And we're just going to start off by kicking it directly. Do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Well, first of all, really thank you so much for having me on a podcast. I love the concept. I love podcasts. So this is really exciting to be here and part of it. I'm an assistant professor at the legal department of Central European University here in Vienna, Austria. And I mainly focus on human rights topics, particularly migration and refugee law, but I also teach classes on environmental and climate justice, on also gender in migration, for example. So it's a bit particular topics mixed with and also like general human rights stuff. Also teaching the inter-American human rights system, for example. A mix of things closer to my heart and things I think that are important foundations for the students as well that want to work on topics of international human rights law.
Cool. And you've worked a lot on sort of refugee rights as well, right? Mm-hmm. The right to migration and also the right to asylum, it seems, as well. So can you kind of give us a primer on that and the context of the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work on this, both from an academic perspective, but also from a practical perspective. So I got into this whole refugee asylum law world by actually doing practice, by doing counseling for asylum seekers in Berlin. I volunteered with Amnesty International during my university years at Humboldt University Law School. And so to add on to my legal education, I wanted to do something more practical. And it was 2015, and a large amount of asylum seekers came to Germany and to Berlin in particular as well. And I and many others felt, okay, we need to be doing something about it. We have this special skill, we're training to becoming lawyers, so we at least know a bit more than the average person to maneuver this crazy legal world, the crazy German bureaucratic world as well. So I volunteered with Amnesty International to help asylum seekers, to prepare them for their asylum process, the asylum interview, and to also appeal, etc. So I got into this academic world on migration and refugee and asylum topics through my practical experience. And I not only did that in Berlin, I also did a semester abroad in Cape Town, where I also helped asylum seekers in South Africa to write appeals and prepare them for their interviews. And later on, I did that also at the border between Mexico and the United States, in immigration detention centers in the US. So I think my practical and academic work, they're always very closely tied to each other and inform each other very much. In this area of refugee migration law, so much is constantly happening. I think this is really one of the legal areas where there's never a moment of stillness. Everything is always in flux, unfortunately, usually into the regressive direction. But it's what makes it super interesting, sometimes super exhausting, super sad to work on. But it's really also exciting to always stay on top. There's so much also jurisprudence on the domestic level, on the regional level, international level that informs this area. And then all of this practical experience then also really shaped my decision to do a PhD in international refugee migration law, where I basically also looked at questions on how do states need to respect human rights at the border. So what do states need to ensure in terms of human rights law when they expel groups when they prevent anyone from entering. This was like my PhD, to also look at what does the law say? How is this historically evolving? Why is it evolving in a certain direction? Also going a bit beyond just the law in the books, but also understanding what were the historical thoughts behind these principles, how did they evolve, and why did they evolve like in a certain direction. And what we recently, especially since 2015, see is it's increasingly going always in one direction when it comes to fundamental rights for anyone at the border trying to seek protection. And this is restrictive more and more. And I unfortunately see this not just in Europe. We see it, we've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in the US, but then also in the surroundings, because all these policies have significant implications even beyond these regions, because these global North states want it to. Like this is not incidentally that this is happening, that we see this happen.
Yeah, so it was nice kind of getting up to date with actually the background of a lot of what's going on. So I hear a lot about the Refugee Convention from 1951, right? And then the American Convention on Human Rights, right, in 69. And I'd heard about these things, but I never actually read them. And I read the American Convention the other day, right? Because I was like, okay, let me at least understand.
Right.
And there's a sense that after World War II, there's this to save us from hell concept in the UN. And there's all this kind of optimism and almost, it seems in hindsight, fetishization of the idea of human rights, right? The display of it. And then we see now how that was, as problematic as that was, it seems like almost the golden age for thought in terms of, right, in terms of what got to the mainstream of normalizing and justifying human rights.
Right.
And since then, the kind of soft power neo-colonial aspect of the UN is taking hold, and now we're seeing a regression of the human rights. So can you kind of explain some of those dynamics as you see them?
Super interesting points. I think one thing that we maybe decided to forget as well is that even when these concepts of human rights, especially with regard to 1951 Convention, were born, it was not that everything was rosy and everyone was like getting together and saying, like, let's do this, and we will, like, from now on ensure that no person will ever have to flee, etc., etc. If you look at what we in international law call the travaux préparatoires, which is basically the original documents that were written down surrounding the drafting of the convention and the protocols, you see that very similar conversations were happening that we see today. States saying like, oh, but what do we do if like a large group of people is coming in? We do not want to have to keep the burden of all of those people, etc. So like, I think sometimes now when we look back at these moments, we see these rosy pictures and think, oh my God, like the world's like learned from its horrors committed during the Holocaust, and now like a better humanity has been born and everything is better. I think these concepts were always imperfect, and they were constructed by a specific group of states with a specific idea in mind as well. And I think the Refugee Convention is a great example. If you look at the definition, which is enshrined in the Refugee Convention, who is a refugee, it's relatively limited and really does not, for example, it does not include people fleeing war. It does not say that. It says that you have to be individually persecuted. So you really need to show that you personally are fleeing because a state or a non-state actor is basically after you. And so again, like, war was not included. If you look at today's world, climate change is not included. And we see that one of the reasons for fleeing that is part of this definition is political reasons. And when we think of the 51 Convention, the time when it was born, I mean, it was like the start of the Cold War. And for example, especially the US was pushing very strongly to include this, because the idea was like anyone fleeing from our enemies can get protection in our territories. So even like these kind of fundamental principles of human rights and refugee protection, they have always been political. They've always been shaped by notions and decisions and interests. So I think this was always there. And I feel that just in the recent past, we see that even these minimal consensus that states have agreed upon is being reduced, again, for other political reasons. And it's a very worrisome development. I just want to caution that I don't think there was always this glorious moment. Politics are always part of the law. And I always smile when especially lawyers and legal academics often like still cling to this idea of the neutral law. And it's, I mean, law is made by people, law is applied by people and interpreted by people. And yes, we have all these methods to interpret it all in a certain way, but politics, especially in issues like refugee, migration law, it's just intersected so closely. So yeah, this is definitely something that I feel like that is important to remind ourselves.
Yeah, it's even impossible to remove bias from science, right? And it's an interpretation. So yeah, that's important. So this is actually one of the things I wanted to ask you, because when you're reading the American Convention on Human Rights, it's really nice for 9 pages. And then it gets into caveats for like the next 19 pages, right? And so this and the absence of war is kind of one of the things I wanted to ask you, right? Because it's on the heels of World War II. And it didn't come to me as the framing as you put it, which now is super helpful. But the idea that somebody escaping war is not so useful to me, but somebody who's a political dissident, then I know that I'm accepting someone who's ideologically opposed to my enemy. Whereas someone suffering war, I have no idea. Maybe they're suffering war, but they're actually in support of my enemy. So this kind of shields them. And I didn't really, that's nice, because I kind of missed that nuance. That's super helpful. So how has there been work by lawyers to kind of include this as part of the interpretation post?
Yeah. So this has been really a decade-long debate. And there are regional approaches as well. So also different regions handle these kind of things differently. So there is this 1951 Refugee Convention, which has almost been ratified by almost all countries around the world. So we see that this means that most countries around the world took this definition into their domestic law. And I do this in class with my students, and I have students from 30 countries around the world, and like one class where they'll like bring in the definition of their home country, and then we compare and we look at historical context to see like, oh, why is one definition more progressive? Why do some definitions use terms like gender? Like you can be persecuted due to gender, especially we see this also in several African countries where this is included, and in others not. And in some also aggression is, for example, included. So we see a variation also across the world. And we see also that, especially in the European Union, the realization has dawned that in today's world, most people who seek asylum flee due to war, at least to a large number. So there is something called subsidiary protection, a concept that then governments came up with to ensure that people who flee war are not left without any form of support, residence title, etc. Unfortunately, and in the case of Europe, many people also from Syria, Afghanistan, etc., got these titles. it comes with less benefits and less rights. So if you meet this very narrow refugee definition, you also have a lot more rights. You can bring your family, for example, and it's a safer title, which also puts you on track to citizenship in most countries, etc. The other one, the subsidiary protection or whatever how the regions call it, comes with less guarantees. So, and we've seen this recently in Europe, in Germany, for example, also here in Austria, that these guarantees for people with subsidiary protection to bring their family has been completely cut. So Austria this year and Germany this year as well, this year, 2025, they both decided this category no longer gets the right to bring their family. So only if you're a refugee under this other definition, you can be both coming from Syria, but one falls in this category and you can bring your family and the other cannot bring their families anymore. And you can imagine what this means for these people that had to flee, had to risk their lives to get to Europe, and now cannot even legally and safely bring their families to where they are. And in the communities, this, of course, is devastating. But this is like a new, not so new, recurring policy decision, also by European decision makers, to say, we need to reduce the numbers. And one way to do it is by not allowing refugees or people with subsidiary protection to bring their families, to make sure the numbers are going down. And the argument there is from these governments that if we reduce that, then people will not come in the first place. No one will risk their life if they know they cannot bring their families. I doubt it that anyone who's fleeing their lives is like looking up the most recent policy decisions across Europe and then based on that decides on like, oh, great, this new policy now entered into force, so now I rather stay and risk my life here than trying my luck to find safety somewhere else. So but I think this is a different topic of like the the detachment of migration policies from data and from the lived realities of those affected by it.
Yeah, the idea that opaque legal changes can somehow act as a deterrent for people who are literally existentially motivated, right? I mean, it's ridiculous to think about.
I know.
As I say. But so what are some of the arguments that you have to push back against, right? Because ultimately, when you read a document like this, it seems self-evident that we ought to implement something like this, right? With minimal caveats, right? And there seems to be a lot of pushback, and it seems like you said, there's a lot of regression, and it seems like a lot of European states are actually looking for ways to circumvent it, where they can say, we're still following this convention, but these people don't apply in this case.
Yeah. I think the most popular argument right now across Europe, in the US as well, is we don't know who these people are. They're coming in. They are maybe criminals. They take away our money. One of the most ridiculous and recurring narratives is really, they come here, they get new teeth. Because like if you're an asylum seeker in Europe, you also have the right to basic health care. I mean, anyone who ever went to the dentist in Austria or in Germany knows like you pay so much on top of everything. And no, just because you're an asylum seeker, you do not get new teeth. But this just shows how absurd these narratives are. People really come up with the craziest idea. I remember like 2016, I was asked after I wrote a blog post and I got angry emails and like, and because of people like you, we, the average German now, we have to host refugees. And sometimes I really don't even know where these narratives come from, what triggers them. And I really think media has a really big role to play, but it's more than that. It is a narrative, I think, that is deeply ingrained in our deepest fears, closely connected to like systemic racism. But then also politicians increasingly really play these cards. If we look at, for example, right now, the situation at the Eastern EU border with Belarus. Since 2021, Belarus has, well, that's what politicians will say, instrumentalized migrants, meaning Belarus, in a form of retaliation against the EU, they handed out a lot of visas to people from mainly Muslim countries. And basically even chartered flights to Belarus, and then first like bussed them to the border so they could enter into like Poland, Lithuania, etc. And then over time this turned into like forced them at gunpoint into these countries. What Lithuania and Poland, etc. did is like one thing, they pushed back violently. People were beaten on both sides of the fence basically. People died. Freezing temperatures, the most horrific human rights violations you can imagine. And these violations, like on the ground, went hand in hand with legal amendments and narratives that they told in Poland and they told to the EU is like, Belarus is instrumentalizing these people. By that, they're basically part of the problem. They're criminals. They do not deserve these fundamental guarantees that we're obliged to follow. And this narrative was so successful that we now, just this year, a new binding regulation entered into force on the EU level, binding on all EU states, saying that states can reduce their rights basically under specific circumstances, and one of them is instrumentalization of migration. So we see how these narratives are not just harmful like in everyday lives, and we see how people speak about refugees and migrants, and politicians actively use this and turn this into the law and turn these illegal practices into legal practices. Like Poland, Lithuania, etc., they legalized violent pushbacks in their domestic law and at the same time advocated on the EU level to make these kind of things legal. And right now, they're making these same arguments in front of the European Court of Human Rights. And we're all, like, people in my human rights bubble, we're all waiting for, 3 really important cases on this to see if the court gives in and says, yes, in these situations, you can deviate from these fundamental principles we all agreed on when it came up with the convention. So it's at this moment, we're really at another very crucial moment where we just can hope that the already horrible situation is not getting worse, but states are very strategically and effectively using these narratives, not just to communicate to their constituents, but to change the law.
Yeah, I think the most disturbing part about this is when you have one state dehumanize a group of people to use them as a tool, because I don't deny the argument that Belarus is dehumanizing individuals to use them as a political tool. And then for the UN to say, well, now that these people are already dehumanized, why should we give them human rights? And this is, I think, one of the most egregious failures of any type of, patting themselves on the back for a liberal order.
Yes.
This is the most disturbing. So what is the kind of legal recourse for this? I mean, what is the kind of argument that you build? And also, what does it mean at the European Court of Human Rights if you get a beneficial ruling? I mean, is there any type of enforcement mechanism? I mean, right? I mean, I know the answer to that question, but is there what does it mean, say, for an individual country to be handed down this ruling?
I think there's no easy answer, and it depends so much on the country and the specific ruling. some countries have a better track record, in parentheses, like if there's a ruling against them that they follow through, and others not so much. And especially right now, we really see a collective and orchestrated attack against the European Court of Human Rights in its rulings on migration law. So it started in 2025. It started like long before, but like it really escalated in 2025. We saw 9 states, amongst them, Italy, Denmark, Austria, the usual suspects that are not happy with what the court does in its jurisprudence on migrants' rights. They published an open letter in which they basically said, this court has been protected the wrong people. They said the wrong people, referring to criminal migrants, etc. Basically portraying the court as one who does like all for migrants, all for refugees, and forgot about the Europeans. This is basically what they stated. And this was followed by a recent letter now of December, in which now 27 EU Council of Europe states agreed to push back basically at the court's jurisprudence when it comes to migration. So they basically say, like, look, court, you've gone too far. You took away too much power, in parentheses, in deciding on like how we need to treat migrants, and this is particularly with regards to like when we can expel someone, under which circumstances, especially when they committed a crime. And we that's why we're at such a crucial moment right now, because we've seen this very strong pushback, and this has been building up for like the last 10 years, and now it's just really escalated. So now we really have to like hold our breath and see what will the court do, because the court is only as strong as its legitimacy and authority. And if the court loses that in these member states, or if states like the UK, who's been for the 100th time threatening to leave the Council of Europe and the court, if they stop following these decisions, then what? On the other hand, it's the clear duty of the court, as it's written in the convention, that they need to protect these fundamental rights. So it's a very horrible balancing act, and one that I'm afraid increasingly will go towards like giving more leeway to the states and moving away from fundamental rights protection for migrants and refugees. So, yeah, it's courts like the European Court of Human Rights really, really strongly depends in its efficacy on how states perceive it, and if states are willing to follow suit. And this is very much under pressure at this very moment.
Yeah, and I think you have this large underlying problem that people feel as though the granting of human rights is selective, right? And so that they can be the arbiters of access to human rights, and that also human rights might be a temporary thing to be able to grant people. So you also have this problem that you take in a certain set of refugees, and the understanding among some people is until we deem that we can send you back, right? And so there's this denial of a fundamental like principle of human life, which is, and when you're living someplace, you make it your home, you know, and to continue to displace people is also a huge violation of human rights. Yes. I mean, your social network, the people you love, even where you go and get your groceries. I mean, all of these things are things that connect us to our social reality, which is so important for how we function, our mental health, our physical health. So I'm going to bring in sort of another case at the moment that's been on my mind, is that with the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president, right? With the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, I've seen already people on the right say, well, great, because we've taken in a lot of immigration from Venezuela, and now we can send people back to Venezuela. And so it seems like there's so many different reasons why states take aggressive action. I think, even though Trump thinks it's for oil, I think the people around him have much larger hegemonic objectives.
Fully agree.
And part of it is this immigration case, which is like, okay, great. Now we have another place potentially to take to send folks also who are not even Venezuelan, but third country. It's just like a third country sending off. And that's, America's been doing that for decades, right? I mean, 80s with Mexico, you have Guantanamo Bay before it was ever a torture camp. I mean, so you have, what is going on here legally? Like, how are people defending this?
Oh, God, no, absolutely right. And I think in the Venezuela case, this has not been sufficiently talked about. And I mean, I think even with Rubio, who himself also proclaimed quickly after the kidnapping that, now they can go back. And I'm sure that this is very dominantly also in the mind of many decision makers in the current U.S. government, because this is part of their mass deportation idea. We need to get rid of the others, of migrants and refugees in our country. So anything goes. I think we've seen that in all of 2025. So I think this is like another nice add-on in their policy thinking. Unfortunately, this is not something unique to the US. When the regime in Syria fell recently, European governments quickly jumped to the same conclusion. Oh, amazing, Bashar al-Assad is gone. Now we can deport all these millions of Syrian refugees. That these people are part of our societies, that they as well have roots here now, that many of these Syrians are already citizens of EU countries, that they don't want to be returned, that they're part of our society, that our societies would collapse if we would send all of them back. This is just like not talked about. And there again, like where we talk about this dehumanization, like anything with regards to refugees, I feel like the only narrative we always hear is like, how do we get rid of them as quickly as possible? And not what the contribution is of these people also in our societies and the human side of them and all of this. And you mentioned all these returns to third countries. This is also such an old trend since shortly after World War II. This also started where, as you said, also U.S. really tried to find other countries that take in refugees, and this really escalated also in 2025. The U.S. deported people from all over the world to any country willing to take anyone. And this was not just people that could not be deported to their country of origin, but also people who tried to seek asylum and who didn't even get a chance and were just expelled to Costa Rica, Panama, later on also to Swatini, to South Sudan, etc. Any country willing to take anyone, it doesn't matter if they speak the language, if they've ever been there, if they have any connections, anything goes. And now it seems that Europe or specific European countries think this is a brilliant idea and that they want to copy this, and they just came up with this idea of like return hubs, and they just recently agreed to find willing states to do similar things, to build agreements with states to take in anyone that for legal reasons or practical reasons cannot be deported to their country of origin from Europe. So this is a severe escalation, a violation of fundamental principles. And I honestly, I can't believe you're still and again talking about this. I mean, there are so many studies and that show that this is not efficient. This will not bring down the numbers of people. It's ridiculously costly. It's a violation of rights. I mean, it's like Europe is just, I mean, like, you can't pretend you're upholding the beacon of human rights and at the same time commit the most horrific human rights violations. Like, I don't know how some EU politicians still can look in the mirror and say, like, yes, Europe stands for human rights. I mean, not just in the area of migration. So yeah, it's we see a continuous escalation in that account. And any question with regards to returning a large group of people, I think this is really guiding a lot of foreign policy conversations at this very moment in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere.
And we've been speaking mostly about the ramifications of war, but you also have essentially the Mediterranean being turned into a weapon itself, which is one of the most disturbing things, right? I mean, how we've lost so many lives purely in the crossing with violent Coast Guard actions, with legal justifications for them, with support for countries that are inland, for countries that are on the sea. And so I guess this is one of the elephant in the room almost with, I guess, this whole debate is climate change, right? Which is way bigger in scale than any amount of wars we'll see. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, of course. Well, first, on your first point on the Mediterranean, it's a mass grave.
Yeah.
If anyone is interested who's listening in, the International Organization for Migration, they have a project called Missing Migrants. And they track the deaths at sea since 2014. And they update it, I think, every 3 or 4 days. Don't check it too often because it's just like you lose hope in humanity. And it's thousands and thousands. And this is just the official numbers. Yeah. And so much to say about that. Really, it's not just that European countries do not save these people at sea. They actively ensure that they're not saved by cooperating with third countries and actors like the Libyan Coast Guard, by financing them, equipping them, training them, in parentheses, to forcibly pull them back into Libya, where they detain them in horrific situations. Where there was this BBC report a couple years ago where the world learned that their slave markets, where migrants who were intercepted at sea were sold, torture is going on, etc. And all of this is partly still happening because the European Union pumps a significant amount of money into all of this. I mean, I'm not saying they're directly funding these prisons, but they funding those who pull them back and put them into prison, etc. So this is really, a horrific crime scene, and something that European leaders really should be taken to responsibility for. And there are cases and lawyers who do amazing work that bring or try to bring these cases to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where they allege crimes against humanity in these cases against leaders like von der Leyen, even Merkel, etc. We know how political all of this is, so I don't see von der Leyen being arrested and brought to The Hague. But I think just the fact that people are working on this and making hopefully these people in charge a bit more worried and maybe a bit more reflective about these actions. I mean, a drop on a hot stone, but hopefully, something that does more than not doing anything. Sorry, and I forgot what the second part of your question was.
No, that was great. With climate change.
Oh, yeah.
Because then the whole problem is exacerbated.
Yes. And I feel, I mean, there have been reports for many years now on what climate change could mean for human mobility. And the numbers range from anything from like 5 to 500 million people on the move until 2050, etc. It's really hard to predict. And I think we also have to be cautious to not create this picture of like everyone will come to Europe. But at the same time, climate change is an important factor already when it comes to the movement of people. And in 2024, I worked in Mexico, in Chiapas, at the project with the International Organization for Migration on adaptation to climate change. And the group I worked with, we also interviewed people in Chiapas that worked on farms, etc., about their desires to migrate with regards to climate change. And Chiapas was an interesting example because there you could see how climate change, in combination with land erosion, in combination with deforestation, hit hard, especially this community. I remember talking to, she was a impressive woman. She's a cacao farmer, and she's like, this is the second year I don't have any crops. The blossoms on her cacao trees, they bloom and then they die. And so in her case, she now like turned her cacao farm into like a tourist attraction. But she also said like, I'm too old to leave. But what about my kids? So for me, this is a very crucial moment to really also like to understand how complex climate change affect decisions to move. And if we look at numbers, talking about Mexico, for example, most people move within their country. There's a strong move from the countryside to the city. Cities have been grown significantly, also due to climate change. But what if the world gets even hotter and situations escalate even further? There's no water, etc. Land erosion. I mean, we've seen really villages in Mexico on the coast disappearing. They're just gone. So what do you do then? And this can really also lead to migration or forced displacement also across borders. And this is where it gets interesting in terms of the law, because as we said before, the law does not say you're a refugee when you're forced to flee because your village just broke away into the ocean. So lawyers try to get creative and try to argument how the Refugee Convention and how the definition can be adjusted. And I mean, there are many cases where climate change already plays a role, also in forced displacement, because sometimes people are violently forced to flee because of like a water conflict. I mean, and I think this is not talked enough about. For example, the whole Syria conflict, it has so much to do with water conflict. So we see this there already, but I don't think anyone is saying like, oh, the water conflict like played this very significantly role, and that's why we need to give these people some sort of protection. So a lot is happening at this very moment. Also, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has been a very leading voice in this in 2025. They issued an advisory opinion. This is like a legal opinion of like 300 pages where they explain how climate change and human rights can be thought together and what are the obligations of states vis-a-vis climate change. And human mobility was part of this. So there the court basically said, states, you need to wake up to this reality and you need to come up with measures to ensure that people who are forced to flee get the protections they need. For example, you need to include people fleeing due to climate change into refugee status. You need to find like climate change visas, etc. And we see this happening not sufficiently, but Australia, for example, last year issued climate visas. Also problematic to some degrees, but it seems that it is really now more on the minds of certain heads of states and the global community that this is something that we have to deal with, and we can no longer pretend this is not happening. And this is a reality we're already facing, and that will just get crazier and crazier with each year that is passing. And each year we just basically put our head in the sand and do not do enough to stop this, and just believe in that technology will solve all of this and we magically will stop this.
Yeah, I suppose it's a right-wing dream that it will decide who lives or who dies, right? And we know how the biases already work in AI.
Yeah.
So,
oh God, oh God.
It's and it's also worth noting that with the American Convention on Human Rights, you have 24 of 35 countries actually ratifying it. Of course, America never ratifies any treaty.
Oh yeah, no.
They'll sign whatever, but they won't ratify anything. So you have this interesting situation where the largest landmass in the Americas, I guess inhabitable landmass, with the exception of Canada, is also has an immense amount of water, is going to be basically trying to build even more of a fortress as more people are escaping climate. And there's a saying that goes around a lot, which is water is the oil of the 21st century, right? Because a lot of cities have 0 days, which is when they're planning on running out of water, which is something we completely take for granted in places where you don't actually have to worry about the cleanliness of tap water. So I guess because you had put out like a post on this, you had written about before the actual ruling, or not the ruling, the advisory opinion in 2025. So what does it actually mean when you're working on this to get that support from a major council like this? I mean, does it lend anything to the arguments? Because of course you have as many legal scholars, I actually don't know what the proportion is, you can tell us that also, of legal scholars who actually are championing human rights, and then those who are trying to erode them, right? And so this is kind of a thorn in the side of those who are trying to erode them ostensibly in the arguments, because when you write something, you're going to cite this ruling, right? I guess because like everything else, like all human knowledge, it's cumulative. So what does this mean when you craft an argument?
Good question. I don't think there is an easy answer to this. And again, unfortunately, all these rulings are as good as their implementation. And in questions like climate change, it's a global issue, so we need the world community collectively to do something about it, and those emitting more doing more, of course. So in the case of the Inter-American Court and this advisory opinion, we already see, in this advisory opinion only came out like 7 months, that states really pick up on it beyond the regional level. So I recently looked into it because I wanted to see also, like, okay, who's talking about it in what way. So it has since come up in many UN resolutions of the General Assembly. The International Court of Justice cited it and said, this is leading. We also see on the regional level now lawyers using this to bring cases, for example, in front of Brazilian courts, saying look, now we have this, you have to follow whatever the Inter-American Court said. So we already see a reception of it, and something that made me personally very happy, that even the European Court of Human Rights, which usually is in this little European bubble and does not sufficiently look at what other courts, human rights courts, do, cited it and said this is really a leading voice on how to interpret climate change and human rights. So to my surprise, honestly, we saw that this particular advisory opinion really had an impact beyond the region. And now it's up to other courts and decision makers and lawyers and everyone involved to push this forward and make it a reality, because the court often also in gloomy words says general things. And now each country also needs to decide what does this mean for us? How do we implement visas for people affected by climate change? For whom, under what circumstances, etc. So it's important and beautiful that we have this opinion. But now the next years will show if it stays just a beautiful opinion or becomes a reality. And the signs that I see so far are positive. And it seems that even though there's, of course, a lot of pushback. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US, at the same time, I mean, it's any environmental climate protection is just completely dismantled. So I think it's a push back and forth, and but at least now, as human rights lawyers, we have a 300 pages legal text that we can point at, saying look, here it says that you have to follow this, states. And in the European context, of course, I cannot use this advisory opinion directly because this only applies to the inter-American system. But I can say the International Court of Justice also issued an advisory opinion, and this applies to all the states that are part of it. So we also really see how now courts seemingly on this question have a dialogue between each other, which does not often happen to that extent. So I think for my own sake, I would still want to believe in international law, because I think if not, then I could also just give up and stop teaching what I teach. But I feel that it does have an impact. And I have to say, this is also, it has an impact to those affected in terms of, I was lucky enough to be part of these proceedings, as I wrote in what lawyers call an amicus curiae brief. It's the friend of the court. So meaning we basically write a legal argument in which we focus on something particular. And I wrote on how other courts around the globe how bring climate change and human mobility and refugee law together. And for that particular advisory opinion, over 260 groups, academics, indigenous groups, NGOs, UN organizations, they all also sent in such a friend of the court. And then we were all invited to come to Brazil and speak in front of the court. And there were so many people affected by climate change. Indigenous groups, indigenous communities that traveled from all over Brazil, from all over Latin America to speak in front of the court. They wore their traditional clothings and they spoke in their traditional languages, and they made their voices heard, and they told their stories, the lived realities, how climate change affects their everyday life, their way of living, their land. And being there and talking to some of the people there and what it meant to them to be there, speaking in front of the court, the judges of the Inter-American Court, and seeing them and being able to tell them what they see and what they live and being questioned. And it meant so much to them. I know critics would say, oh, it's all circus and how much does this then really make their lives better? But from my personal experience there, it meant so much. And this is really something that Europe and other regions really could learn from, and how to include the voices of those affected by it and the voices of those most affected by it. So that was really, really something very impactful, I would say, and that the rest of the world needs to pay closer attention to.
Yeah, enfranchisement is so important. I mean, in the in the same document, right, the American the Convention on Human Rights, one of the points is political participation as a human right, and I think that this enfranchisement is so important because it says that you are valued, and I think being recognized and being heard is part of the human rights when we're building a society, right? And that it's such a beautiful thing, and it ought not just stay at lip service, right? But that's the first step, is including parties, right, to the table. And, when you talk about things like the United States basically dismantling its whole climate preservation infrastructure, I mean, one of the other things that it's dismantling is our access to the information. Oh, yeah. So it's stopping the EPA and the National Ocean and Atmospheric Association, the NOAA, from actually gathering data. So there's an epistemic justice problem as well. We don't have access to the information. And like you said, I mean, with this organization like Missing Migrants, for example, if we don't know what the problem is, then how are we going to construct an argument? How are we going to push the politicians? So I think, I mean, that's a lot. Just a sort of a clarification thing, because as I'm dove into the world the last few days to understand what
the hell lawyers do.
How to get the most, how to really get the most out of your mind. So there's is it correct to call the Inter-American Court more of the Central and South American Court? And is it when I'm trying to make sense of the courts that have major sort of ruling, you have the Inter-American Court, you have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice in Europe, in The Hague, and then you have the European Court of Human Rights in France? Strasbourg. Yeah, okay. And then you have the African Court of Human and People's Rights.
Yes.
These are the four main courts. Things kind of bounce around between them. Am I missing any?
No, you're absolutely right. And in the African and Inter-American system, they're all complemented by a commission. So there's also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in the African context, the African Commission on Human People's Rights. They have different tasks and different roles, but they also complement these human rights systems. Then there's also, the Arab Charter, for example, which talks about some monitoring body which never saw the day of light. So this is really something in the Asian region that there have been attempts in the past to also set up a similar system. To this day, we do not have something comparable. And this is complemented also by other international instruments. So yes, we have the International Court of Justice that deals with disputes between states. But then we also have the International Criminal Court, also in The Hague. They did really good lobbying. That deals with individual criminal liability. So that is about criminal law. People commit crimes against humanity, and they're extradited there, and then they're individually sentenced. So this is about individuals being there in the International Court of Justice. It's like one state against another state, basically. And then we have on the UN level also other formats, particularly the UN treaty bodies, which are even less powerful than courts. Because so there are a lot of international treaties, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, etc. Like the treaties that deal with specific questions. There's also one on the protection, like women, for example, anti-racism, etc. And many of them then come with this treaty body. And these treaty bodies are like experts that come together, and it sounds awful. It's not a pretend court. Like they really have important, they may find very important findings, but they're not directly binding. So when you want to bring a case to a court, you always do a strategic balancing. You always think, okay, what forum do we choose? And it depends, in which region are you? In which country are you, for example? Can we bring this to a domestic court or to a regional court or to an international court? And where are we more likely to win? And if we win or lose, what are the consequences? So these treaty bodies, on average, are more progressive in terms of interpreting migrants and refugees' rights, but their decisions are less impactful when it comes to how states see them. So it's always it's like a balancing act in seeing like what strategy to take. And there's an interesting move in the last years, more away also from the European Court of Human Rights, because the European Court of Human Rights has been more and more restrictive in its interpretation on migrant rights. So those who strategically bring cases to courts take this into consideration and now also look for other fora where it's maybe more likely to have a positive outcome for the clients you're representing. So again, the law is so political and strategic, and it's not just conservative right wings trying to work with the system. It's also like the human rights bubble trying to strategically push back and try to get positive outcomes as well for our clients and for what we believe in.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of your recent work has been on some specific cases on Poland and Germany, right? And the attempt to basically remove some of the transparency of what they're doing, it seems, if I understood it correctly, and also basically a subversion of the law. So you have these states essentially trying to write their own laws, which are regressive as a position on human rights, and they almost delegitimize the centrality of decisions of the court, right? Correct any of this, but so you have this issue where if states start taking their own rulings, if they start acting, if they start obscuring their behavior, then we actually lose that accountability chain. So what does that look like?
Unfortunately, in the area of refugee migration law, accountability is so hard for many reasons, and secrecy is one of it. And this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. Many agreements also between EU states and third states, between the US and Rwanda and the US and any other states, they're not publicly accessible. How do you go against any of these agreements in courts if you don't even know what they're saying? And this is really a long-running issue, and a lot is really, in this fog of secrecy in this whole in this area. And we see also states using this strategically to really make it hard to bring claims to courts, and to get this accountability. And in the case of Poland, for example, but also like Lithuania, Latvia, they in the recent past, after 2021, have really also jointly basically decided to domestically move away from the international standards and just like trying to close down their borders. And as far as I know, this has also come with a crackdown on human rights activists and human rights lawyers to prevent this accountability. So I would argue, and human rights organizations argue this, it's a combination of the secrecy with a crackdown in certain areas of those who are trying to work towards accountability. Yeah, I mean, none of this is new. I also remember when I worked in Immigration Detention Center as a volunteer in the US, it was under Trump 1. Before you enter this as a volunteer, you write, well, they're going to sue me, a non-disclosure agreement. And there is always this looming threat that you do not get a visa in the future. Because there have been cases, even under Trump 1, where no one was even talking about this, of lawyers working in human rights, working especially in immigration, that from one day to the next had their residency revoked, etc. So I think there, in specific countries, is also this attempt to really disincentivize people working on this to push for accountability.
Yeah, so I actually plan to ask you about the Mexico border. So with regard to what you can tell us about the experience, because it's so opaque for so many of us. I mean, we don't know what's going on at the border. We have to rely on whatever outlets are able to report. And also, we don't hear often about the kind of work that you did at the border. A lot of people who are engaged, I mean, we have a vague sense that this is happening, but at the very least, even if you can't get into specifics, what does that work look like on a day-to-day basis?
So I worked in immigration detention center on the U.S. side in Texas under Trump 1, and then on the Mexican side in Tijuana under Biden towards the end. So anything that I say is to be understood in the context of this very moment. The situation both at the border and these immigration detention centers is under constant flux, and it has been for under any presidency in the past years, because policies constantly change, and this means changes on under what circumstances people can cross, not cross, are apprehended, are returned, etc., can apply for asylum, cannot apply for asylum. My understanding now is really no one can apply for asylum anymore. It's done. It's it's not an option anymore. So when I was in Tijuana, that was Christmas 3 years ago already. It's really hard to describe because the circumstances are so horrific, because it's really people, and a lot of them families with small kids, with toddlers, pregnant women, either sleeping on the streets or it's not, you can't call it accommodation. It was basically a roof, and then under this roof, people slept in tents, and then when it was raining, the tents were floating away. There was very limited medical help, and the worst thing about all of it is the insecurity. The organization I and my partner volunteered with, they also reported about cases where clients of them, while waiting at the border to enter the U.S. to legally apply for asylum, were killed, because Tijuana is a violent place, especially for people who flee gang violence. And we worked with people from all over the world. There were a lot of people also from Afghanistan, for example, who had worked with the U.S. in the past closely and were promised safety and didn't get it, and who sometimes we had a lot of women, many Afghan women who tried to follow their husbands to the U.S. who had received access, but the U.S. never came through with promising the family reunification. So they risked their life and flew into Brazil and then made their way all the way up to Mexico and the U.S. Really under horrible, horrible circumstances. We saw a lot of unaccompanied minors. I'll never forget, there was a 4-year-old girl from Haiti, and she was unaccompanied, and it was Christmas, and the border was basically already closed, and the organization asked us to hand over this 4-year-old girl to the U.S. immigration authorities, because minors were the only people they would let in. Without this appointment, because at that moment in time you had to have an appointment. It was called CBP1 app. So on the app you made an appointment, and then 3 to 6 months later you got this day when you could present yourself at the border.
3 to 6 months in the tent in this situation.
In the tent,
that's what we're thinking. Okay.
Hiding, and these were the lucky ones. Like,
right.
These were the lucky ones who had a tent. Right. So the only exception was like minors. So we like handed her over because then these minors are taken into like U.S. family support system, where then they have to spend a couple of weeks there and then are reunited with their families in the U.S. And but it's like these are the moments that you never forget in your life ever again. And it was just, I don't speak French Creole, Haitian Creole. It was just so heartbreaking to see this 4-year-old little girl there on her own, alone. I was just pleading also. We were pleading with this officer, just like, please make sure, like, please take her in. Please, like, I don't know, be good to her. We also had a couple of boys from Afghanistan, and you hand the officer the papers, and you're just like, I'm not religious, I pray to whatever, to like, please, like, take them in. And they just looked at their documents and like, this looks fake, and like, he doesn't look like a minor, and you're just pleading basically, and they, I mean, I think it's also like part of this like circus they play. They then let them pass, and like we heard through the organization afterwards that they were reunited with their families, and I really feel it broke me to some degree as well. And I had the same experience when I worked in the U.S. in these immigration detention centers, because in these immigration detention centers, it was a center for mothers and their kids and pregnant women. I just can't wrap my head around how people can detain toddlers. And the stories these women told us, because we were only allowed into a very small portion of the detention center, for them to like even get to this detention center, like they went through horrific days, sometimes weeks, in what they call cages and what they call the refrigerator, because the temperature in these cells was turned down, so they would just really freeze. There was not sufficient food in the detention center. There was not sufficient health care. There was like one doctor who only gave in like pills if you have a sore throat, and like Band-Aids basically. And it was a decision about basically their lives, because in these detention centers, they were all there to see a decision maker that would either send them home on the next plane, or would let them enter in the U.S. to wait for their day in court, where they could present their case for refugee protection. And what we did, we prepared them. Because how on earth are you supposed to know what part of your story you're supposed to tell? Because you got like 5 minutes with this decision maker who asks you basically, what are you afraid of? What's your story? And they basically have a checklist. So like, you need to basically fulfill this refugee definition, or you need to like meet a specific legal threshold that if you work in this area, you understand what this means. But like, imagine and I had so many women who just like fled the most horrific violence, and they had scars, and they had like open wounds, etc. And then suddenly you're in this detention center, and you got 5 minutes to tell to a random guy who is like a state official gown that you've been raped, that you've been persecuted, that you fled for your life. And this is the moment that decides about whether you're returned or whether you get into the country. And I really, I mean, this has been like 8 years ago. Like, I still so often dream about these women. I just hope that they're safe, and I hope they made it. Because it's just so arbitrary. How on earth are you supposed to know what part of your life to tell in these couple of moments that give you the chance to seek protection? It was really, really horrific. And I mean, I know nothing about how to detect trauma, but I've never seen small children being so quiet. They were all just sitting there, not playing. They were all forced to wear the same clothes. It's like prison inmates. There were very few games. They were just like sitting there, and like it was really inhumane. And to me, it was so shocking to also see, and I think this really showed me this also like the banality of evil. Of the guards. Many of the guards were Latino women. They speak the same language. They look similar. And they were horrible. They were treating these women and these children like animals. And there we come back to our conversation of dehumanizing. And like it really made me question once again humanity, in a sense of like how can we do this to other people? And I understand for them, I mean, their job depends on it. They also have to feed families, etc. But like I really struggled with that. I think like for 1 week I was just like crying. I was like, I'm done. Like humanity is just like, we're doomed. So yeah, I think really there are just so many examples how refugees and migrants are just so mistreated. And in theory, the world knows about it, but the outcry is so limited. Yeah, and I have not found the secret on like what to do about that to really wake up a bigger part of our society.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, the most difficult part is knowing that it's been going on for decades. That didn't start with Trump one. There was a lot of violence in the Obama years. There was a lot of violence in the Trump years, and Bush years. And you have a state with so much wealth, so much land, which is acting so violently, and often doing this thing of having people who would otherwise be victims of the violence, selecting few and having them play this, I mean, very, again, dehumanizing model minority type role. And I think one of the things that people who enforce violence don't understand, and their relatives and their friends, is that there is a real cognitive shift that happens when you have to engage and enforce violence on people. And that is a dehumanization of them, of people at the border forced to inflict violence on other people, no matter how calm they look, no matter how normalized it has become in their day-to-day routine. Right. You have traumatized people traumatizing people. Right. And this is the greatest disaster, right? Is that nobody there, whether they're there to enforce or there to help like you were, is coming out of that untraumatized. This is what we're creating. And it's the point you make about the portion of the Afghan population that was promised by the U.S. in their colonial project that, hey, if you help us out, we will bring you in.
Yes.
The hypocrisy there. I mean, especially in the fact that when they pass laws that they say will be deterrents, people will hear about the obscure things that we do in our country as deterrents, even though they know that no other country that they have an imperialist intention with, nobody there will hear about the Afghans that they turned their backs on.
Yes.
So they know that none of this information is going out. And that's not even, an obscure legal precedent that they've set. It's actually that They promised you help and they denied it.
Yes.
And they know that word's not going to spread.
Yes.
And
it's not just the US. Germany did the exact same thing just in 2025. They had legally promised to bring in Afghans who helped the German forces. And now just they broke their words. And there were German court cases that said, you need to bring them in. And guess what is the government doing? In their narrow-minded way of like looking at migration politics at this moment, they denied them. And what's happening to them now? Like many of them are in Pakistan, but Pakistan will now return them to Afghanistan. And these people they are judges, human rights activists. Guess what will gonna happen to them? And you know how big was the outcry? A couple of people in the human rights community writing and talking about that. But if you look at German media, yes, there were articles about it, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's hard to make people care about these kind of topics. I think especially also when it deals with people from Afghanistan, people who have a Muslim background. I think like deeply ingrained racism in the US and Europe, it's just like plays such an important role in all of this. Also this whole like white nativist movement in the US. If you look at US policies, this has always been a red thread throughout US policies, and sometimes they try to hide it better, and sometimes like now they don't even try to hide it. It's just so out there in the open.
Yeah, there's a movement that's actually gaining a lot of traction called a heritage American. And this is this idea of people who appropriate some story about their white settler colonialist ancestors, right? The claim of indigenousness of a Northern European who came to the United States 400 years ago. And a lot of them, of course, so many are going to be, of mixed ancestry, of people who, have probably not Northern European ancestry and came in the last 100 years, and they're claiming this sort of heritage American idea. So it's the difficult thing is that we're seeing the parts that over the last few decades, as we're both millennials, growing up as a millennial, these are the things that you had to come to realize were driving it, right? Racism, misogyny, classism. But to see it being even spoken out loud seems like such a breaking of a promise of the society that we were told is being handed to us, right? Yes. It's such a severe regression from what we thought. And it's one thing to look at sort of the ebbs and flows of progressive politics in the history of the world, but it's another thing to actually come into sort of the middle of your life when you're putting out your work, and to know that you're in the you're in the regressive time, and it's very it's not really pacifying at all to think, oh well, maybe by the time we're 80, they'll shift back towards progressivism. I think the important thing is there's no guarantee of any shift back towards anything. I mean, we could be entering 1,000 years of dark ages in terms of, and it's this type of work and the awareness of the things that are going on and the contribution in whatever way that we can make towards upholding that thing that we hold valuable, that is going to keep the needle from moving even further in the direction. I would like to, I feel like this whole thing is kind of why you do what you do, but I would like to ask the question kind of directly. Why are you doing the work that you're doing?
I think it's just a deep sense of conviction that I need to use my white German privilege and the skills that I learned to contribute to a better world. And of course, like a better world in the sense of like how I understand and how I would like to see the world, one that is more just, that is more equal, that is safe for everyone. And I think it has much to do with like probably upbringing, probably also values our parents teach us from a very young age. And then I think this combined with like world events that I noticed firsthand. I think I mentioned this in 2015 when in Berlin suddenly you could see so many refugees or asylum seekers on the streets, standing in long lines to apply for asylum, etc. And that this like experience in my neighborhood, in my city, then really triggered something. It's like, I need to be active. I need to use these legal skills and anything I have to contribute something to make the situation of these people better. And then I think one really decisive moment for me was as well when I became a legal guardian of an unaccompanied minor from Afghanistan. That was also, I think, 2016, because there were so many minors coming into Germany, and they all needed legal guardianship, because without a legal guardian, you're a minor, you can't even apply for asylum. You can't open a bank account, you can't enroll in school, etc. So they were looking for volunteers who would become these legal guardians, and it was really a life-changing experience, because I really understood what these laws and these politics mean for those directly affected by it. And it really opened my eyes about systemic racism as well in Germany. And it's one thing to know about it in abstract terms, and then to see it through the eyes of someone that I deeply care about and that I spend a lot of time with at this moment. And I think this really settled it. Like, I want to dedicate my life to this. And I don't necessarily see myself for the rest of my life being an academic. I was in academia, then I was out of academia for 5 years, working with the UN, working with NGOs. Now I'm back in academia. So I don't necessarily have a straight plan where I will continue this fight, but I feel it. I can't imagine anything could happen that would deviate me from this idea of these like values or what I feel is the right thing to do. Really, the values I strongly believe in, and I just try to reflect about how to best, in whatever circumstance of life I'm in, serve this now as an academic. It's like, yesterday was like my first year here at CEU. So I also reflected a little bit about it. Like, what is the role of academics now? What can we do? Is it enough to just write blog posts, write academic papers, talk to the media, etc.? What else can we do to contribute to pushing back against all these restrictive movements that we see? And I think it's a constant readjustment as well. But I really think in my case, it's like life experiences and values that have been given to me also by my mother, particularly, that really shaped my vision of the world.
Yeah, right on. And maybe we can close with, because you're in a unique position to understand what contributing to this effort looks like. I mean, where do you see yourself kind of moving into if you were to move away from academia? Like, what does that work look like?
Good questions, hard question. Because I feel any role I ever had, I always struggled with, am I actually doing enough? Is this the best way of how to use my skill sets? For example, when I volunteered in Tijuana, in Texas, I felt I'm really helping people very concretely with this very concrete preparation for the asylum process, telling them, okay, these are the risks, this is the law, this is how it works. But I also felt it broke me. I don't think I can do this forever. I was just so devastated as well. So like I thought a lot about also like balancing this. And I feel right now in my academic position, it's a combination of like writing academic posts and like this year also really whenever I could, I talked to media. And this is honestly something I was not aware of before, but like when you have the title of assistant professor, actually people start listening to you. Like I given several like interviews. I talked to journalists, like background information, etc. I was like, I can't believe these people like actually want to hear what I have to say and like take it seriously and publish it. So I think this is one thing. And right now I also think on like how I can combine this with then more hands-on direct things. So with 2 colleagues here, we just want to start a law clinic, meaning where we want to also train future generations. So like right now I'm also focusing very much on making sure that it does not end with us millennials, but that the next generation is like behind us and we're collectively pushing for it. So I really try through my teachings to reach as many people as possible as well and like join forces and find ways in reaching more people. And I think this is one thing that I really need to think more about, and a task for me also for the next years is how to reach even more and how to reach especially a broader public that does not usually think about these questions, that may have very solid opinions in like going different directions. Yeah, I think this is the next move I have to do to find approaches on like how to effectively reach people outside of our bubble, because I think only this way we can actually be effective and do something more systemic about it.
Yeah, right on. I'm looking forward to seeing what shape that takes. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's deeply meaningful.
Thank you.